Welcome back, Bike Club listeners. And on today's episode of the Bike Club podcast, we're going to be talking about MVPs, or otherwise known as minimal viable products. Now, you'll notice if you're watching on YouTube or the video portion of this podcast that my background's a little different than usual. And for those of you listening on a device and not seeing the video, it's a kitchen. And the reason why we're in the kitchen here today is because we want to talk about, before we start this episode, an event we're hosting this September, on September 9th, called the Pasta Bowl. Now, for those of you who don't know, ATSAP is actually pasta spelled backwards. And the reason behind that name is kind of a funny story about pasta being my favorite food as the founder of ATSAP. But it also kind of plays into a little bit of a marketing scheme here where we believe that no idea, no matter how big or small, is a bad idea. And it just takes the right ingredients and the right people coming together to kind of mix up and cook up the best ideas. So that's the kind of reasoning and branding behind the Pasta Bowl, and kind of the reason why today we're sitting in my kitchen. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this episode and how you can sign up and register for that event. But let's get started and let's start talking about MVPs. Okay, welcome back, and as I mentioned, on today's episode we're going to be talking about MVPs, or minimum viable products. And we've talked about sort of this idea in past episodes of the Bike Club podcast, and the reason why minimal viable products are important is because, especially when you're an early stage startup company, you don't always have a ton of funding or a ton of money, so you don't have the funding or resources to come up with that best product, or I don't want to say the term best product, but maybe the full-fledged product is maybe just not in your budget, and that's okay. And that shouldn't shy you away from or make you afraid to kind of pursue forward and formulate this idea into an app or software product. And we've talked about in past episodes the idea of the clickable prototype. Now, we've explained briefly what a clickable prototype is, but I want to talk about this first because that's basically the first example of an MVP. So let me break that down into two portions. When we're talking about minimal viable products, they can be broken down into what we like to call two different kinds. Type 1 is the clickable prototype. This is not a fully functioning app. It is actually just almost like a image or kind of website mock-up or still image mock-up of what the actual software or app might do or how it might function, but it's not really functional. There's no back end to it, no database, no APIs, nothing. It's just for show. It's just something to kind of help better paint the picture or the idea of what your product is supposed to do. The second type of MVP that we work with is an actual minimal viable product, something that you would actually kind of think of when you think of minimal viable product. And that's where we actually code up a software app that might not be the full-fledged software app. And what we mean by that could be something, for example, let's say you have this idea for a mobile app that has these 5 main features. And maybe to launch the MVP, you only go with 2 of those 5 main features, simply to save time and money and to kind of test the market. So maybe you don't do all 5 of those features of that app to start. Maybe for the minimum viable product or the MVP, you do the most 2 significant features. And to kind of test the market and get your product out there. And we've talked about this also in the past on previous episodes. The reason why these clickable prototypes or this MVP is so important is for really 2 main reasons. And I want to talk about the main reason why the clickable prototype is so important. The clickable prototype is super important because what you can do with the clickable prototype, it's a better way to explain to your friends, family, and potentially some investors what your product is, what it does, and how it actually functions. You could sit there and you can or you could speak your idea to anyone, to your friends, family, or anyone that's listening to you, and every person kind of has their own vision or idea of what that product is. So as a founder or someone who's creating a new product, you need to be kind of specific about what your product is and does and how it's going to work. And so the clickable prototype allows you to kind of basically pitch that idea to your family, friends, or potential investors and kind of showcase exactly how you want your product to act. And that's super important because that helps you formulate your idea and kind of not get lost in translation, for lack of a better term. Now, this is a good way to, like we said, kind of pitch your idea and get investors, but what about the second type of MVP that we talked about, the actual fully functional app or software that might have limited features or aspects to it to kind of fit in that budget to just kind of get it out to market? What's the benefit of that? And there's a lot of benefits, and it kind of has the same amount of benefits as the first one, where you can basically take that idea and show it to investors, show it to family, show it to friends, to kind of basically show them exactly what your application or software is supposed to do and how you want it to operate. The big difference, though, between here is cost. It costs a lot less to have a clickable prototype, and it costs a lot more to have an actual fully functional MVP. So if you're not necessarily tech savvy, you don't know how to code yourself or how to kind of design a website or app yourself, it's probably best to start with a clickable prototype. However, if you have some funding or can code yourself and can kind of code up an MVP, that's obviously the route to go. Now, the nice thing about the MVP too is the nice thing about the MVP that is the actual fully functional app or software is that it's going to save you time in the long run. And what I mean by this is if you take my example from the beginning of this episode, where maybe you can't afford or can't do the 5 main features of this application, but you can do two of those 5 main features you can actually develop in this MVP, well then you're a quarter of the way there. You've already done most of the legwork and only need to now focus on 3 of those other 5 features. And so obviously, as you can tell, that's going to save you time. It doesn't save you money per se, but it mostly saves you time. Clickable Prototype will show you what the product is and does, but what it won't do is it's not functional, so you can't actually stress test it in certain environments. So the other nice thing about the fully functional MVP is that you can actually stress test this, send it out to beta users, send it out to 100 users, send it out to 1,000 users, stress test this, see how this is going to go. Whereas Clickable Prototype, you can't really do any of that sort of market research or technical research. You could definitely send the clickable prototype out to a test group and kind of get feedback on layouts of buttons and UI design and whatnot. But what you can't do is get that kind of technical feedback where you can kind of stress test it or see how people interact. That's the big difference. And so that's why it's kind of important to understand these 2 different types of minimal viable products when you're in that kind of prototyping or early stage phase of your project, because when you understand which of those 2 versions of an MVP is going to work best for your company or your startup or your product, then that's going to help you kind of streamline which direction you take. Now, a lot of companies that we work with, before they kind of even start coding an MVP, they will do a clickable prototype first, just because, as we've explained in previous episodes, that clickable prototype also serves the function of letting developers understand the product that you're trying to have developed, and it also gives things like measurements of where buttons should be placed and spacing between different objects and whatnot. So it's also important in that aspect. But again, it has limitations in the actual technical aspects of that prototype. So again, depending on what your end goal is, it's important to understand which MVP is the best route for you to take or for you to go with. Now, to reiterate what we kind of talked about here today on these 2 different versions of the MVPs, is version number 1 is the clickable prototype, where it's it has the UI design, shows the different screens, the layouts, the button designs, color schemes, etc. But there's no actual physical backend to it, no database, no APIs, nothing that's actually interacting with the user. Everything is just basically static. Whereas the actual fully functional MVP is an actual software that's going to be written and coded that can be a mobile app or a website, software, etc., and actually will connect to a database, APIs, and backend features, etc., and can be stress tested at the technical side. See how it scales, get user feedback, send it out to multiple beta users and whatnot. And that might also be a better way to attract investors, because if you have a product that is engaging, has good user interaction in your beta testing, that's something that's going to attract a lot of investors. So that's something that's really important when you're kind of figuring out what type of MVP, if that's what you want to do, what type of MVP you want to bring to market first. Now, we've thrown a lot at you here on the MVPs here, on the topic of MVPs or minimal viable products. And before we wrap up this episode, what I want to talk to you about here today is, again, the postable. And I can kind of throw together all kind of information and post these videos and these podcast episodes, and you can listen to them, watch them, and find them engaging and get good information from myself and from my team. But we've been getting a lot of feedback as to, or questions asked to us about more additional information on the topics that we talk about. And so I want to highlight the postable one more time before we end this episode, because if you're really interested in entrepreneurship, app development, and software development in the software industry, and you want to learn more about how the industry works, you want to learn more about entrepreneurship, you want to learn more about MVPs and what's the best way to kind of take my idea from idea to product to market, what's the best way to kind of formulate a business plan or a financial plan to get investors, then I highly encourage you to sign up for our postable, which is going to be September 9th of this year. We'll put in the link of this episode the registration page for you to go on and sign up for. Tickets are $15, so they're super cheap, super affordable, and we actually have a promo code going on right now, and that promo code will actually be also be in the episode description as well for a limited time for about the next couple weeks or so. So sign up now and get that free ticket through that promo code, because I really want to encourage all our listeners and viewers to come to this event. Because like I said, we talk a lot about different informational material on this Bike Club podcast. But for the people who really have those really cool ideas and they want to learn how to take that idea from idea to product to market, the best thing you can do is come to our postable event, talk to our team, pitch your idea, learn more about app development in the software industry and entrepreneurship, and really take the next step in bringing your idea from idea to product to market. Thanks again for watching today's episode of the Bike Club podcast, and like always, let's build together.